Hello, friends. Today I am joined by Dr. J.L. Wile. I am so delighted that he is here today. He holds an earned PhD in nuclear chemistry and a BS in chemistry, both from the University of Rochester. He has won several awards for excellence in teaching and is an internationally known speaker, having presented lectures on the topics of nuclear chemistry, Christian apologetics, homeschooling, and creation versus evolution in several different countries. He's best known for his award-winning K-12 science textbooks designed specifically for the homeschool. I was telling him here before the recording started that I remember using his chemistry and physics high school textbooks back in my own days as a homeschool student, and I'll actually be using one of his elementary books this upcoming year with my two younger kids. So it's really a delight to get to chat with you today. Dr. Wile, that was like an official introduction, but can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, how you first became interested in homeschooling?
I became interested in homeschooling because I was a professor at Ball State University, which is in Muncie, Indiana, and I ran into these students who were just head and shoulders above the rest. And I remember the first time I found out that one of them was homeschooling. I was sitting in my office hours, and hardly any students ever come to your office hours, but this student comes to my office hours, and he's a student I recognize as one of my top students that year. And he sits down and he opens up his book and he points to an equation called the Gibbs free energy equation, which is a pretty difficult equation to use. And so I figured he's going to ask me, how do you use this equation in problems and so forth. And he said, I've used this, I've done all the homework and I understand the equation, but I've been thinking about what this equation means. And suddenly, like, all the gears in my head just stop, because I have this student who's in my office who's actually been thinking about an equation. And so we have one of these 45-minute discussions that every professor dreams of, talking about the real detail of what that equation really means. And at the end, I said, well, you're obviously one of my best students and you must have had a really good chemistry background in high school. Where'd you go to school? And he kind of looked at the floor and he said, at home. And to me, because I knew nothing about homeschooling, that meant that he was too sick to go to school. And so I said, oh, so you had a tutor work with you between your teacher and keep you up with the students? And he said, no, my mom taught me. And I looked right at him and I said, so she's a nuclear physicist then? And he said, no, she never went to college. So that was my first experience with a homeschool student. And, that got me interested. I started doing a little research into what the education literature said about homeschooled students. And the education literature said my experience was, even back in the early 90s, which is when this was, my experience was pretty common, that homeschool graduates make better university students. And to this day, they still do. So that's what got me interested in home education. And what's funny about that is, I started speaking to homeschool groups. Mostly back then, it was how to get your kids into college, because that was difficult in the 90s. One reason that we at Ball State had a lot of homeschool graduates is Ball State University, of all the Indiana universities, had the weakest entrance requirements. So, they were kind of the fallback school for a lot of students, but for homeschool students, they were the one that would actually accept them. And so that's what I was mostly doing. And then I got convinced to write curriculum and so forth. So I spent a couple of years doing this. And then suddenly my wife and I adopt a teenage girl who had been going to public school her entire life. And so we actually, we first were her temporary guardians. We couldn't do anything with her education. But once we adopted her, then we pulled her out of school and homeschooled her the rest of the way. And that's when I really learned about homeschooling. Now, once again, this was in the 90s. So she's an adult and married, and she and her husband own a shipping business and so forth. So she's an adult now, but she did not want to be homeschooled the entire time. But shortly after she went to university, she actually thanked us for homeschooling her, because she saw what that had given her compared to most of her peers.
That is such a fun story. I love every bit of that. As a second generation homeschooler, I've had little moments like that myself where I'll be speaking to a doctor. This was a funny thing, and I'm, using anatomical terms for certain bones of the body and things like this. And they're like, "Oh, do you have a medical background?" And I'm thinking to myself, "No, I just like learned a lot of really great songs, when I was being homeschooled." So as you've kind of been in this homeschool world now, for the past several decades, has your thoughts about home education kind of grown or deepened over the years, or what changes have you seen?
Yeah, so I've seen changes in homeschooling itself, but in my thoughts of homeschooling have changed as well. Like when we adopted our daughter and we homeschooled her, uh, um, she had a really terrible home life before us, and so she was one of these kids that when things were going well she learned, and when things weren't going well she didn't learn. So she had a lot of holes, and so basically I did sort of what I called educational triage with her. I kind of just tried to fill in the holes and make it uh, possible for her to be successful and so forth. But actually, homeschooling her changed my views of homeschooling a lot, because when I went into homeschooling initially, and even when I started homeschooling my daughter, it was all about academics. It was all about making. I mean, obviously, the fact that we wanted to raise her as a Christian and the school wasn't doing that was a big deal. But my focus was academics, and by the time we got done, she had done really well academically and so forth. But what I realized was the real benefit to homeschooling was the relationship I had with her. Because in the end, because my schedule was more flexible than my wife's, she was a research scientist at a pharmaceutical company. I was a professor, and so as a professor, I could sort of uh, uh,
Flex your
make my
schedule.
hours, yeah, flex my schedule and so forth. So I was principally in charge of her homeschooling, and my wife says all the time that she wishes she could have done more of the homeschooling, because she sees that we have a relationship that's different from my daughter and her relationship, just because we spent so much time together. And I learned stuff about her that I otherwise never would have learned. When you're sitting at the table, you don't talk about things like the Magna Carta. But when it's a part of history, you do. And as a result, you learn things about your child you otherwise don't learn. So to me, now that I've done all of that and I've looked at things over the years, to me, the fundamental aspect of homeschooling is not the academics, it's the relationship. The academics are going to be better. The data are really clear on that, but that's not the main reason you homeschool. And it's not even the spiritual side. The spiritual side is really important, but you can do that by doing a Christian school, doing serious Bible study at home and things like that. So even if your child's in school, you can support them spiritually. But just spending so much time with them, talking about things you otherwise would never talk about, and because we homeschooled, and I was used to reading to her, reading certain things to her, paragraph here or there. We got to the habit when she was driving, when we would travel, she liked to drive, I would read to her, just read aloud while I was in the passenger seat. And that sparks a kind of relationship you otherwise don't have, because now you've got this shared story you're experiencing. You talk about that shared story. And so, all of those aspects sprung from homeschooling. And if I hadn't homeschooled her, I wouldn't have the close relationship we have now.
I think that idea of relationship being the real gift in many
Yeah.
ways, the strength of homeschooling has been crystallized for me over this past year. Of course, that's something I've said many times, but over the past year, my youngest son has leukemia, and so there's been a lot of hospitalizations and
Yeah.
treatments, and not very much academics. We're a family that loves academics. We love rigorous learning, and that just wasn't able to happen this year. But to see the value, to see it not as a wasted year, not that it hasn't been hard and disappointing in many ways, but to see it as still being a successful homeschool year, because we were able to still be together. We were still able to share the stories, to be able to have conversations and still learn too. But to have that time together is really precious.
Yeah, absolutely. But then I've seen homeschooling change as well over the years, because, when I started, in homeschooling, it was not only mostly Christians, which it still pretty much is, but it was mostly the very conservative side of Christianity. So, it wasn't unusual to see a lot of, hair buns and
Denim
head
jumpers,
coverings and denim jumpers and things like that. And nowadays you don't see a lot of that. It's a much more sort of quote unquote relaxed environment. But what I really see is the second generation. I don't know if this is true for you, but the second generation homeschoolers that I see mostly, they're significantly less interested in dogma. Back in the early days, I would get curriculum thrown back into my face when they saw that I wasn't quoting from the King James Version AV 1611, and now I haven't just experienced that in years, because for whatever reason, I think at least from the standpoint of rigidity, homeschoolers are less rigid than they used to be, and I think that's a positive thing. Now I do think that there has been some secularization of home education that I don't like very much, but I think that within the Christian home education world, I do think it's become a little less rigid, which I like.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I feel like that could be a whole other podcast episode, because I have some thoughts about all of those things. but I do want to kind of dig down a little bit specifically in the issue of science, or the topic of science, not the issue. Of course, you are a scientist. You've written all these wonderful science textbooks. So I'm kind of curious, first, in your own personal experience, what first sparked your curiosity, your interest in science, and then how your perspective has grown and changed over the years.
Well, I was part of that generation where the educational psychiatrists or psychologists thought that they could give you a test when you were 6 years old and it would determine what you were going to do when you were grown up. So I dutifully took that test, as all of my first grade companions did, and it was said that I was going to be a scientist, and so they tracked me towards science, and I honestly didn't like it very much. I did it because that you really didn't have a choice. You couldn't opt out of this kind of stuff. So I didn't really like it that much. And however, when I got into the later years of high school, I was an atheist, and I was kind of proud of being an atheist, because I really thought that atheists were smart people were atheists, and of course I thought I was a smart person, so I wanted to be an atheist. But a girl who I was trying to date, who never wanted to date me, took me to that's an interesting story of itself, but still good friends. But she took me to a debate between an atheist and a Christian, because she was a Christian and she thought it was weird that I was an atheist. And that atheist Christian debate, the Christian was actually a scientist. And in my head, and we all look at our past in a very selective way, but in my head, I think that's the first time I actually met a scientist who was a Christian. And he suggested some books towards the end of the debate about science and how that relates to Christianity. And basically, he threw the gauntlet down as far as I was concerned, because he said, if you want to be an educated person, you have to look at things from all sides. And if you haven't looked from the Christian side, then you don't really know. And so that was kind of a challenge to me. So I read some of these books, and that's what got me interested in science, because the science that I was being given there wasn't the boring stuff that I was learning in school. It was really interesting things about very detailed aspects of nature, and how things are perfectly balanced in nature and everything. And that was interesting to me, but still wasn't interesting enough for me to go into it as a career. So I started my life as a professional actor. And that's like, for example, you see Man of La Mancha over there, Sweet Charity over there. These are plays I've been in since I've been an amateur. But yeah, I started my life or my career as a professional actor. And after about a year, realized that wasn't for me. But during that year, and I think this is what really sparked it, it's a long story, but what really sparked it was while I was an actor, I had to do stage magic. And it was like I played Dracula, and I had to like look at a cigarette and light it. I played the thing I remember most was Pilate in Jesus Christ Superstar, where I have to put my hands in this glass jar that's transparent and perfectly clear. And as soon as I put my hands in there, the whole thing turns red. And that was all chemistry. And so I didn't really understand the chemistry, but I knew I was playing with chemicals and so forth. So when I decided acting wasn't for me, I said, well, I've had fun with doing this chemistry on stage. Why don't I study it? And then when I got to university, of course, the science you learn there is radically different than the nonsense you learn in high school. And so in the end, that got me really interested, but I probably would have never gone into chemistry if it hadn't been for my stint as an actor.
That is such a creative backstory. I would never have guessed that is, was acting that led me to
Yep.
nuclear chemistry.
Yeah, I tell people I used to be a professional actor, but then I made the next logical step and became a nuclear chemist.
That's hysterical. Okay, so were you a Christian then already as you began your studies at the university? And how did that
Yes.
kind of affect the way you thought of science then as you
So
Yeah.
my private study of these books and so forth led me to the belief that actually Christianity is the most rational way to look at things. Of course, that's in your head. What changes your soul is what's in your heart. And so it took a while for it to travel from the head to the heart. But that was one reason I left acting, was because I was kind of flirting with Christianity during this stage. And you see, the professional theater world, especially, at least back then and probably more now, is so incredibly just narcissistic and hedonistic and you kind of saw the consequences of that lifestyle. And since I was seeing Christianity as a reasonable alternative, I thought I think I'd have a better life outside of this hedonistic culture and so forth. So by the time I actually went to college, I was a Christian, but I was a young Christian with all these crazy ideas about what it means. I mean, believe it or not, I actually had the sincere belief that God would never let me believe anything that was really wrong.
You forgot about that little thing about like original sin
Yeah.
corrupting the whole man.
Yeah. So, so I had all these crazy ideas, but, I went to a secular university, but I grew incredibly spiritually. And part of the reason I think is because I had to address these challenges that were constantly being brought towards me. And I didn't do it alone. I was a part of a Christian fellowship group called the University Christian Fellowship Group. And so I had upperclassmen who had already faced a lot of these questions, helping me out and so forth. And so like when my daughter went to a secular university, I said, that's fine if that's the university you want, but you're going to have to be a part of a regular Christian on-campus fellowship because you have to have some way of supporting, your spiritual life.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important.
It is. My oldest son is going into his second year at a secular university, but has a wonderful Christian campus ministry as well as a local church. So I'm very thankful for that.
And I think that's by far more important than what the university is teaching. You can have a vibrant spiritual life in a ridiculously secular college as long as you're plugged into a really alive campus fellowship.
And on the flip side, I think sometimes parents think, oh, I'll send my kid to a Christian school and they'll be fine. But if you're not being fed spiritually as a member of a local church, I don't know that you can still live a very pagan life at a Christian school.
If you can.
Well, before I go off on another tangent, I think many Christian parents do have this idea. They kind of fear science. So, which makes me think back to your experience before you had seen this person who was actually smart and a scientist, but who also believed in God. Like, how can that happen at the same time? I think sometimes Christian parents, I see some fear around finding, a good science curriculum or talking to their children about science as if science and Christianity can't really coexist. Right. Or there's just some fear there. So what would you say? How would you explain the relationship between science and Christianity and how we can approach science as an opportunity for doxology and for learning more about who God is?
Well, there are two sides to this. One is the academic side. If you look at the history of science, if it weren't for the church, we wouldn't have the science we have today. We'd have something, but it wouldn't be anything like the science we have today. The reason we have the scientific method is because in the year 1000-ish, the Bishop of Lincoln said, basically, we've developed this thing called theology, which is a method by which we study God's revealed word. Now we have to develop a method to study God's natural word, his creation. And Grosseteste never really did much with it. He suggested some things, but one of his predecessors took that to heart. Not predecessors, one of the subsequent generation took that to heart, Roger Bacon. And he wrote a huge book that was supposed to just be an introduction to a bigger book that never happened. And part of that huge book, section of it was called The New Experimental Science. And basically he laid out the idea. It's not enough just to come up with an explanation. You then have to figure out how you can experimentally test that explanation and how that explanation needs to be verified by experiment. First time ever someone laid it out like that. And it was because it was motivated by theology, really. It was the theology of the natural world. And so, there's no reason to think that Christianity and science can't coexist. And we see people today, I mean, one of the world's greatest synthetic organic chemists of all time, James Tour, says he prays whenever he comes up with a result he doesn't understand. He actually says, graduate students bring a result to me. We don't understand it. We're both baffled. I pray about it and I ask the Lord to illuminate, and it happens. So the idea that Christianity and science can't coexist is really silly. Now, from a personal side, the way you should look at science isn't as some academic exercise. It's actually studying what God has made for you. And so you shouldn't be afraid of that. You shouldn't be afraid of studying God's creation. It comes from God. Now, it's been corrupted. Blaise Pascal, another brilliant scientist, said that nature has some perfections to show that she is the image of God and some defects to show that she is only his image. And I love that because that's the way we should look at nature. We can see the power and majesty of God in science as long as we understand that it is a corrupt version of the original creation.
That is you shouldn't be afraid of it. I'm going to have to find that and print it out.
It's in his book. It's called Pensées, which is French for thoughts. And it's a bunch. It's like 150 or 300 pages of just thoughts. And they're deep thoughts. But I teach a master's class where we study the great scientists of the past, and his work is one of the ones we study because he was so important and so influential. He's got other great quotes, but that's probably my favorite quote about nature.
Well, I think also, as we know from scripture, that nature is declaring the glory of God, right? And so exactly. I think that so many times as I'm studying science and you just realize like the intricacies and the beauties, and you're filled with wonder, and it leads to praise because, this is the author of what we're learning about is even more incredible than the creation, right? The creator. And so I think that's such a gift that science can give us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, if a parent is maybe unsure or feels ill-equipped to teach science or maybe any other subject, we all have that one subject that we get a little nervous trying to homeschool. What would be your tips for a parent who's trying to provide a good education to their children on a subject like science maybe they don't know a lot about?
Yeah, and I think being afraid of science isn't really a reasonable thing. Now, to be worried that you're not equipped to help your child learn science, that's reasonable. I mean, most likely, I could say categorically that most people's science education was really poor.
Except for mine, obviously, because I used your books.
That's right, exactly. But I think what passes for science in most of our public schools, a lot of our private schools, is just really nonsense. So I can understand feeling ill-equipped. And the way you do that is the same way, let's suppose, your child wanted to figure out how to make an engine work or how to fix an engine. What do? Yeah, you find somebody who knows about engines and you get them together and you try and get them to show your child what's going on there. And I think you can still do that with science as well. Now, it's a little more difficult because you're not going to know a scientist necessarily, but I think what you can do is you can obviously find a curriculum that meets your needs and helps you. Like, for example, our curriculum has a free question answer service, so you can always get answers to your questions. A lot of homeschool curricula have that. But also, I think you need to be on the lookout for ways to introduce your child to these people, these scientists. So let me tell you, I love this story. This student who used my books now has a master's degree in marine biology. And I asked him, what made you choose marine biology? And he said, if he thinks back, his mother was just looking in the paper and noticed that there was a whale biologist who was going to come to their city. That's on the coast, it's a city on the coast, to speak. And she didn't know anything about marine biology, but she thought, okay, this is science, and my kid seems to like science. So let's go hear this this professor, this marine biologist. And they get there, they're the only ones there. and the marine biologist is on top of a whale, standing on top with a chainsaw, cutting into his head, into the whale. The whale's dead, obviously. And so the guy looks at and looks right at the student and says, "You want to come up here?" And of course, he asks a kid who likes science, "You want to come up on this dead whale and look inside?" Of course he's going to say yes.
That's
So he
amazing.
climbs up. Yeah. And he says, if I had to point to one thing that made me decide on marine biology, it was that experience. Not just that this guy was wielding a chainsaw on a whale, but that he got to see a whale's brain and different different organs in the whale and so forth. And so I think that's what you need to do. If your child likes science, first of all, check the people in your congregation, the people in your friend circle. Do you know a scientist, an engineer? Doesn't matter if it's exactly what the kid's interested in. If it's science, you might learn something. And, I don't know about other scientists, but whenever anyone asks me, do you want to, spend a few hours talking science with my son or my daughter? Yeah, absolutely. Because that's my passion, right? So I think you can do that. And you can also look for opportunities like, local museums often have hands-on time. And it doesn't matter that it fits into a curriculum or anything like that. You're homeschooling, so 2 hours at a museum where you watch somebody, do some experiments or whatever, that's your chemistry lesson for the next couple of days. Right. So I think that's what you do. You fill in your weaknesses with a good curriculum, but also with these extra opportunities that are out there.
And I loved that you brought up that it doesn't have to fit specifically the subjects that you're, the topics you're learning about in your science curriculum. So much of homeschooling, like one of the joys of it is we have so much extra freedom and flexibility in our schedule, and just be able to expose our children to new things. Like, you never know, that mom would probably never have guessed that was going to spur her son's, curiosity and interest in that particular topic. But the more just hands-on opportunities, the more they're exposed to different kinds of people pursuing different areas in science or other topics as well. And there's so many even professional organizations. I know in our area, I did a field trip, hosted a field trip where some of the architects from like the local professional architect organization from many different companies, they come and do these free programs for students, which is applied physics, and in many ways. So my husband is an engineer. He loves going over and talking to us about bridges. I have a friend at our church who's a botanist. He brought a research botanist, and he let us bring a few homeschool kids into the lab at the university and do things. So there's so many creative things you can do, and it doesn't have to, count for something. You don't even have to put it on the transcript or write it on a list. You can just do it for fun because learning is awesome.
Yeah. And you asked me earlier how things had changed, how my view of homeschooling has changed. That's something that changed. I mean, I was so worried about educational triage with my daughter. I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about getting her out to see things. So she was like 20 years old. we were driving through town and we passed this dairy that's been in the town for generations. And I said, have you ever gone into that dairy and had a tour? And she said, no. And I thought I had her in homeschool for 3 years and I didn't think to take her on a tour of the dairy. So I scheduled a tour of the dairy to adults. The person was a little weirded out at first, like, this isn't a school. Nope, just a father and his daughter. His
You're
adult
never
daughter.
too old for a field trip. They're always fun.
Yeah. So I mean, and that's one thing I would change now. I would once again get rid of the strict academic timelines and all that, and spend a lot more time going out and seeing real things, real educational stuff.
I think that also makes children more interested when they're reading in a text and because they understand that this isn't just words on a page.
Yeah.
These are not just sort of esoteric ideas, but these are things that affect, our life, and they're things you can see and touch and taste around them too. Well, I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be using one of your elementary books this fall with my two younger kids. And one of the things that I haven't seen with any other science curriculum is you have chosen to do your elementary curriculum in a chronological form. So instead of it being topic like, botany, astronomy, or whatever, it's actually organized chronologically, the lives of the scientists. And I was wondering if you would kind of explain to us why you chose to take that approach for your elementary science books.
Well, this actually goes back to a group called My Father's World, which I don't know if you know. They're a homeschool curriculum group. They have this real knack for finding out of print books and getting permission to print them again and so forth. Well, they had this book that was out of print, had permission to print it, but then suddenly they were going to, the whoever owned the copyright said, no, you can't do that anymore, change of ownership or something. And so they needed something to fill that place. And it was basically science ordered by the days of creation. And so I admire both David and Marie, the people who own that, a lot. And so when they asked me, do you think you could write something like this? And I looked at it, I said, I haven't done any elementary, but sure, I'll take a look at it. And so I decided it had to be something hands-on because it's little kids. And so my wife and I, because she's a physicist, my wife and I spent time thinking about experiments we could do and so forth with the kids and everything, and had a blast doing the 6 days of creation and an experiment for every lesson and everything. When that got done, I thought, I've enjoyed this, and I really enjoyed working with my wife on these experiments and so forth. I could probably keep going. And I initially thought maybe I should do topics, but then I thought, everybody's done topics. And the days of creation are the beginnings of history. So why don't I just keep going? And I had studied, I for a long time had been reading the great scientists of the past. So I knew a lot about how science developed in those thinkers. And I knew how influential the church was and all of that. So it was fairly easy, at least to start, especially Science in the Ancient World, which is the first book after Science in the Beginning. That was stuff I knew pretty well, because this is where science really had its foundations. And so, we continued working on it, and I enjoyed, once again, working with my wife on these experiments and so forth. And I enjoyed kind of filling in my holes, because I had read, Newton and Ptolemy and Copernicus and so forth, but I had never read Vesalius, who is, and that was a little later, but nevertheless, I'd never read Vesalius, who is, one of the most important anatomists in history. And so it was, fun to kind of read those scientists I hadn't read yet as a part of doing this book, or doing this series. So I just enjoyed it enough. I kept going.
And so do you think that it's something that would be best then to coordinate with the history you happen to be studying as a homeschooler, or does it not really matter as much?
Well, I think there are two sort of benefits. If you do it chronologically, the major thing you see is how science works. Because science is the story of one person coming up with an idea that's almost totally wrong, and subsequent people refining that so it's closer and closer to accurate. And so if you do it chronologically, you see that. I mean, for example, it was thought for hundreds of years that the liver made the blood, and it was delivered to the tissues and consumed by the tissues. And that was all the way to the 1600s. So when in Vesalius's great work of anatomy, he doesn't have the heart in his drawing of the circulatory system, because the heart wasn't part of the circulatory system. It's part of the nervous system. It actually gave you movement. Because nobody saw that the veins and the capillaries were connected. It took a mathematician, well, it wasn't a doctor, but he used mathematics to calculate how much blood would have to actually be made every day in order for this to happen. And he said, this is crazy. Nobody can eat this much food. So in the end, it's neat to see how that develops from very, very wrong ideas to closer and closer to correct ideas. And that gives you besides seeing the process of science, it always also shows you how tentative science still is. Vesalius was as certain today as Fauci was about his ideas of medicine, and we now know they were both wrong. Right. So in the end, I think, it shows that science is very, very tentative. Now, the other benefit is if you don't do it that way and you actually tie it to your history spine, then you're actually experiencing the science of the time of history you're studying. And there's benefit to that too. So I think either one of those works. I think it mostly depends on how important the history spine is to you. If the history spine is really guiding everything, then yeah, you should correlate. And the website for Brain Builders actually has a place. If you go brainbuilders.com/history, it shows you all the major history spines that, like Story of the World and Mystery of History and all that. And it shows you where our lessons line up with their lessons. So you can do it that way if the history is really, really important to you. I think if that's not that important, I think the development is much better.
I think it's really fascinating to see the history of science, because you also see how ideas have consequences, right? You don't just have these sort of, well, this scientist was just over here in isolation doing his thing that had nothing to do with what was going on in the world around him, right? You see how it's really real people and ideas and movements of philosophy, and then how people who come after are impacted by those who came before. And like you said, it gives us a healthy dose of humility as we approach our science studies.
Well,
right?
And the other thing you learn is how sort of arbitrary some of this is. Aristotle came up with the geocentric view of the unit, what he called the universe. In roughly the same time period, just shortly after, a guy by the name of Aristarchus had a heliocentric view. And his view is more correct, but nobody listened to him. Why? Because Aristotle was considered so much smarter. And you see that all of the time. We believe someone not because his view is necessarily any better based on the data. It's just he's considered more competent for some reason.
Okay, well, as we think about then moving into the older teens, as we're thinking about what to prioritize in their education, I could imagine someone saying, well, my kid isn't really a science kid. They're not going to go into a STEM field. I'm not going to really prioritize science in their high school. How would you reply to that? Do you think it's still important to have a good, solid science foundation, even if you're a liberal arts kid?
Well, I was an actor. And now a PhD nuclear chemist. I don't think there's any way that. I remember back when I was getting my PhD, we graduate students had to go to these seminars where people would come in and tell us the research they were doing. And they flew in this guy to talk to us about Stradivari instruments. He was doing research to see if there was anything objectively that you could set the Stradivari instruments apart from everybody else. And he was using a lot of the same techniques that I was experienced with that had nothing to do with music. So afterwards, I asked him, what in the world made you want to do this? And it turns out he had a story similar to mine. He studied violin at the Eastman School, which is one of the finest music schools in the nation, sat second chair in a major orchestra. And then at one point got some book at a secondhand bookstore about how a violin actually makes its noise. And he knew the basics, obviously, but he didn't know the details. And he loved the book, but there were aspects he couldn't understand. So he enrolled in a community college physics course just to get enough to understand the book. And then a few years later had his PhD. You know?
That's amazing.
And so you really don't know what's going to turn your student on. You gotta if you don't expose them to them, they'll never expose it to them. You'll never know. Um, so what you have to do is you have to at least let them experience it in some way. So, I say a goal for every parent is by the end of high school, student has to have had biology, chemistry, and physics, because those are the three broad strokes of science. Now, my daughter did not finish physics. She got about halfway through it before she graduated. So she didn't finish, but nevertheless, she was exposed to it. And I think that's important, because you never know what's going to really turn your student on until they actually experience it.
And there are so many connections between the disciplines, among the disciplines, and it deepens our understanding of one as we learn about something else. So I think we hamper ourselves, we really starve ourselves if we only focus on our area of interest and don't think we need to worry about anything else, because we're going to only have half of the picture of what's
Well,
going
and
on.
I know another person. She's a science illustrator. She is so good, she can charge $100 an hour for what she does. And she says the only reason she can really illustrate, she was interested in art, wasn't interested in science at all. But her mother, homeschooling mother, made her do biology, chemistry, and physics. So she knew enough about the science that when someone tasked her at first, hired her freelance to do this series of anatomical drawings, she basically knew it already. She just had to look up some details. And as a result, she could do it much better than most artists.
That is really cool.
Yeah. So now she charges $100 an hour.
I picked the wrong profession.
That's right.
Podcasting doesn't pay that
Doesn't pay
well.
that much.
No. Oh, Dr. Wile, this has been so great to be able to chat with you today. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you the questions that I'm asking all of my guests this season. So the first is just, what are you personally reading these days?
So I just finished Coming to Faith through Dawkins. I don't know if you know if you heard that book, but it's basically people for whom the mega new atheist Richard Dawkins was fundamental to them converting to the faith. And so
that's the power of the spirit right there.
Exactly,
he can speak through donkeys.
Yeah, you can even speak through Dawkins. So that was a really good book. I'm currently, because of the political situation, I'm currently just started Hillbilly Elegy. Since J.D. Vance has just been nominated, I wanted to get his view. And I hear it's a really good book, but I've just started it, so I can't really say anything about it.
I put that on hold at my library as well. I got to get my research done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, the final question I have for you is, what would be your best tip for dealing with a homeschool day or a homeschool season that seems to be going completely off the rails?
Wow. Okay. Well, I would strongly recommend getting out of the house more. And so doing more field trips and things like that, because part of the reason it's maybe going off the rails is you're stuck in some routine that's not enjoyable for anyone. And even just doing the same thing you're doing, doing reading, but doing it under a tree at a park rather than in your house. Just get out, do field trips, get into new locations. That can spawn, more interest. Also, the big thing, man, we homeschool because we recognize the weakness of the school system. And yet, what do? We bring the school system home. Get rid of the idea that you have to cover this, 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 and this, and this. A good homeschool year is when your kids learn a lot of good stuff that's challenging but not overwhelming. That's a good homeschool year, whether it's, whatever, whether it's following any curriculum or not. You're educating your child to become a real adult. And any kind of education that furthers that goal is positive.
That is such a good encouragement. Well, Dr. Wile, where can people find you all around the internet?
Well, I have my publisher is BereanBuilders.com. The Bereans were the folks that Paul said were wiser than the Thessalonians, because they actually searched the scriptures to make sure what he was saying was true. That's the kind of people we want to build. So BereanBuilders.com. And that's where you can find all of my books and so forth. I also have a blog, blog.drwile.com, and it's DRWILE. I don't update it a lot, but I do update it occasionally when I find something of interest.
Okay, and I will have links to those things in the show notes for this episode over at humilityanddoxology.com. Those of you who are listening, please make sure to take a moment to subscribe, to leave a rating and review in your podcast app. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you're subscribed there as well so you don't miss any future Homeschool Conversations episodes. And until next time, happy homeschooling.